Hello, my creative friends, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Prompt. If you're new around here, this is the point at which the videos are going to probably take on a bit of a different meaning if you haven't watched everything up to this point versus if you have. So I do strongly recommend that if you're new here to maybe start at the beginning and watch the whole thing. I know that's a lot to ask. You can watch a recap video. You can watch sort of watch everything at double speed, whatever. But what we're doing today is I'm going to be building upon what we started talking about yesterday, which is the target that we're going after with the project that I'm going to be building, that we're going to be hopefully shooting in a couple of months. Which will be the thing that kickstarts the independent film studio project that we're putting together. If none of that made sense to you, you probably need to watch some other videos to sort of catch up to speed. Because what we're going to talk about in this video today is money. Let's talk about money, part 2. If you haven't seen part 1, which was a couple of weeks ago, I started talking about sort of the overall sort of money angle on this whole thing, sort of how we approach the money side of things, how thinking about money can change the nature of how you approach the job itself. And we really, as creative people, want to make sure that we're not driven by the money from any part of it, because it really does affect your intuitive creativity. But what I want to talk about today is how money colors part of the creative process. In a couple of videos, I think it's last week, I was talking about the missing element of most screenwriting projects, and that is the production element. The vast majority of screenwriting education focuses on teaching how to write for the page. It's focused on the 3-act structure story or whatever formula approach they're going to use. It talks about principles and dynamics for creating story, and it's all about really helping writers put their words on the page. Unfortunately, when those words get submitted to somebody like me, independent producer looking for material, what ends up happening is it's not actually viable. It's not something we could do anything without substantial further development, which costs money, which independent producers anyway just don't have to pay. So what independent producers at least need is a more ready-to-go, viable, what I call production-ready screenplay, which is a screenplay for a solid story that all the elements are solid, and it's something that an independent producer could actually make. Now, there are many different levels, and I don't mean that as a hierarchy, but I mean just different sort of places where films are made at. They can be made at very big budget studio films. They can be made sort of high budget independent films. They can be sort of lower, what used to be considered low budget films, somewhere between the $1 and $5 million range. Or these days, what's considered low budget is only a couple of $100,000 perhaps, or maybe even micro budget film, which is down to $0 or down to $10,000 or $50,000, something like that. Now, the story that you create, if you create a story and it includes elements within it that are not capable of being produced or not capable of being actually logistically made on the lower budget levels, well, then that project, no matter how good it is, no matter how good the story idea is, no matter how effective it might be for an audience, the producer or the production company can't say yes to it because at the lower budget, they're not going to have the means to achieve that. So when we talked yesterday about the audience that we're going for, which is specifically a science fiction audience, specifically because a science fiction audience tends to be engaged by the idea, tends to be engaged by the possibilities, or thinking about the quirkiness of a situation, or thinking about the effects of technology or whatever it might be, right? So because they tend to be more focused on the ideas, they can be often more forgiving of budgetary limitations. So by creating a story specifically for that target, what we end up enabling ourselves to do, or the budgetary frame in which we, the sort of bubble we put ourselves into that we have to then create from, is a no budget level or a very low budget realm, right? So if we're going to make something for, as I'm going to try to do, for as close to $0 as possible, what we need to be thinking about are what kind of story ideas might we be able to actually logistically go out and make for effectively no money. Now, if you're going to make something with effectively no money, chances are you can't have a car crash, right? Because the car crash will cost money to do. Chances are you can't saw a car in half because unless you happen to work at a junkyard where there are half-sawed cars, then you would say, hey, I can create a story around the half-sawed cars, right? So you can use that production element. You can use that. It gives your film enormous production value because it looks like you went out and did that, right? It looks like you went out and cut a car in half, when in fact, all you did was pull that half car off of your lot. So it's this kind of thinking that has to inform the creation of low and no budget storytelling. So very famous examples from the past would be somebody like Robert Rodriguez, who, when he made El Mariachi, which is a movie that he shot in a couple of weeks south of the border in Mexico, in a small sort of dusty town, shot it from just the right angle so it looked like an even smaller, even dustier little town. He had a guitar case, he had a guitar, he had a wheelchair, he had access to this bus, he had access to specific things in specific locations, and he created a story around those things. Now, what's different to what that is to what I'm talking about, and in Robert Rodriguez's defense, that story, El Mariachi, was definitely a story-driven project, in my opinion. He did what kind of I'm recommending to you guys to do, or what I'm recommending to do at this level, which is create a story-driven project using what we might have access to. Now, since you guys don't know me, you don't know what I have or don't have access to, creating something for the producer or the production company for that lower level, that micro level, is going to come from one of two places. It's either going to come from creating a generically easy to shoot project that includes those ideas, that includes that story, that's going to be able to engage that audience, includes a sort of generic story that anyone could go out and do, because you're including elements in your story that are easy for pretty much anybody to access. So something like a house or a car, or if we don't have to have a specific car, and if that car doesn't get crashed into something, then pretty much any little indie producer is going to be able to have access to that, depending on your location, your region. Some parts of the world, if you happen to be watching this YouTube video on some parts of the world where there are no cars, or where not everyone has a car, well then obviously then it's whatever elements are there generally, right? So the point is, the challenge that usually happens is that when filmmakers go out to do this kind of a thing, they're driven by the shooting of it. They know they have these three unique elements. They have the bus, they have the guitar case, they have the wheelchair. And so they think about what to shoot, right? They're not thinking about story. They're not thinking about creating something to engage an audience. They're not thinking about where they're going to market that film. They're not thinking about how they're going to take the audience on a ride. They're thinking about what's going to look cool. They're thinking about just shooting something and figuring out in post. They're thinking about the production rather than thinking about the story. And it is my contention over a great number of years and some trial and error along the way that a production-led project is ultimately not going to, not always, but is typically not going to be able to connect with an audience. At least it's not going to be able to connect with an audience as well as something that you have designed for an audience. And that's pretty much my sort of general premise here. So let's talk about money. So from a money perspective, if there is no budget with which to make something, then we have to start thinking about what are things that can generally be done for no money, or what do we have available to us with which to design a story and to design that ride in the first place. Now, I know that a lot of people watching this are going to think, well, I don't want to make no budget films, or I'm beyond that already. I've already won screenwriting competitions, or whatever it might be. The reality is, no matter what budget level you're writing for, budget plays an important part in it. I want you to think about if you take what so many writers misunderstand this very point. If you take what I'm saying and you think, well, in order to write a story that's going to be able to get made, I need to reduce the number of actors. I need to reduce the number of locations. I need to create sort of stories that don't use any production elements. Here's the thing. If you get that story into the hands of a producer that's looking for a $5 million to $10 million film, they're probably not going to want to make that because it looks and feels too small. There's no way that a big studio is going to make a micro-budget film. So it's not about limiting things. It's not about restricting your budget. It's not about pulling anything out of it or going into it with limited thinking. What it is about is understanding the producer's needs. It's about understanding what the production company is trying to achieve with this project. If it's a big Hollywood studio making a big tentpole film, you're going to very specifically want big budget, visual effects laden action, and you're going to want the visual splendor in your story. And if you don't include it in your story, it becomes something that a big studio is probably not going to want to make, particularly for those kinds of movies that are getting made these days. So it's not about limiting anything or restricting your budget. It's about understanding how to align with your target. So this is why when people ask me questions like, what do producers want to see in a screenplay, or how do I know if my project is production ready, or that kind of thing. It really depends on who's your target. It depends on what world are you writing this project for? Are you writing for Hollywood? Are you trying to get that agent that, CAA or William Morris or something? Are you trying to get that? Are you trying to break into the Hollywood studio system? Or are you trying, as I'm suggesting through this series, to create that lower level, that sort of indie film level that is going to create the buzz, that's going to create the interest in you as a writer, that's going to open that door to get that meeting at the Hollywood studio, right? In order to create that one with the buzz, you're going to need to create material that fits within the budget parameters of whatever level you're writing for. Now, for me and for what I'm setting out to do on this project, the specific goal is to do this for as close to $0 as possible. So what do we need to think about? What ideas do we need to keep in our head? We need to keep in our head production feasibility. So if we know that I'm going to be making the project in Los Angeles, so if we're going to be making it in Los Angeles, generally speaking, we're probably not going to want to write snow into the story, right? Or weather elements. We probably want to think about generally sunny day. Or maybe nighttime, but shooting at night, I don't know if you know anything about production logistics, you may need better camera. You may need something that can capture a lot of low light situations and make something that looks really good. Am I able to do that? You wouldn't necessarily know that until we talked, until we became sort of partners on the project. So should you set a story at night or during the day? Or should it be some combination of the two? How logistically challenging is it going to be for the producer or production company to make that? So this is when I said before in earlier episodes, the production element, it's not about a list of things to include. It's about understanding the team that's going to be making the project and creating the story with that in mind, creating that story with your knowledge and your experience from prior projects, right? So For me, we're probably haven't yet decided if the story is going to be set primarily during the day, primarily at night, some combination of the two. Haven't really thought about that yet. Well, thought about it, but haven't decided on that. Once we decide on that, if we say, okay, the story is going to be set entirely at night, because I think I go out and maybe shoot some tests and figure out, no, I can do that. I can make that look pretty kind of cool. We can increase the production value perhaps by shooting everything at night, by giving it sort of a blurry lighting sort of look through just the way that we work the camera. Well, then suddenly the story ideas can come out of that production reality. So then we take those story ideas and we figure out how to juggle them around to create the most compelling story that's going to fit that production reality. So when we talk about money, particularly for low and no budget projects, when you're talking about creating something for nothing that can actually get out there and find an audience, if we take, let's say you write a scene where there's a car crash, okay? And the movie centers around that idea. If you have the car crash and you don't have the money to make the car crash, you're going to have to cheat the car crash in some way. Maybe film a car going like this, and then from another shot, or maybe somebody's reaction going, in another shot where we're looking at the car already smashed up, where you're going to use a double car, right? Some other car that's already smashed up. Can you see how right away it becomes potentially a production issue? If it looks cheap, if it looks fake, if it looks like you just didn't have enough money to do this thing right, it's not going to have the emotional impact on the audience. It's not going to be able to, they're not going to be able to suspend their disbelief and go along with this story, because they're going to go, the car that just drove past is a different car than the car that smashed. What, I wasn't going to notice that? Now, if you're making a comedy film or something that's playing with those ideas, sure. But I'm generally not going to recommend that, because it's very easy for that to get overdone. So what I'm suggesting is that we actually make stories that are going to affect an audience in a way that gets you those further meetings, right? That shows people your abilities and your talents as a writer. So we need to make sure that the production looks like an actual movie, that it feels like an actual movie, that it's technically polished enough to pull the audience through. So generally speaking, if we're going to make something sci-fi, we're going to want to try to keep it with as few actors as possible, because when I go out and try to shoot something, if the actor's not available that day, what are we going to do? Then either that's a day we don't shoot, delays the overall production, or these kinds of logistics, these kind of production realities, the economics of that. When an actor's working for you for free or for a percentage of the film, or some sort of deferred agreement, even if they're a student, even if they're willing to work for free, at the end of the day, you probably still have to feed them. So if you have to feed them, you're probably going to be buying meals and that kind of thing. So there will always be some basic costs unless you can really structure the shooting of something. So how can we design a story that is going to be compelling and engaging and intellectually draw in that science fiction audience, but also be something that we can do on this lower budget level? And that's where the story thinking has to come into play. That's where, as a writer, we start to take those elements and use those elements as part of our story development fodder. Does that make sense? So this is why ultimately I believe writing for low and no budget is actually good for you as a writer. It limits the world in which you can play. It limits your resources, which focuses your creativity. So ultimately, my belief is that if you can write a compelling, low budget indie screenplay that can be made for very little to no money at all, and that story is engaging in its own right, then that is going to be a better showpiece than any spec script you can write. And that's what ultimately we're trying to do here. So to sort of pull this back and let this be a prompt for you today. When you think about your project, you have to think about how money and how the production cost of it, or the realities of maybe marketing it, or the realities of who you can get involved in it. You have to think about how that colors and can actually boost and enhance the creative process. It can boost and enhance the story that you create. The story you create is going to be better by you thinking about that stuff and infusing that stuff into your creativity than if you just randomly went off and wrote a great story that you're interested in, because you're going to focus your creativity to try to solve specific objectives, to be something that can be made at that level. Does that make sense? So another aspect of the money thing, before we go, another aspect of the money thing is, what do we have available to us? One of the great challenges that I've had and that I've been sort of expressing and lamenting throughout the series so far is whether people join us or not, right? So if people, here's the reason I keep talking about people taking advantage of these tiny little windows and joining us or not. Because ultimately, if you think about this, and this is true, and I'm going to apply this to the bigger picture as well. If we had, for example, 100 people joining us through this process and then ultimately going to the writer's room, those 100 people bring in resources with which we can expand things. So when we talk about money, we need to understand the whole picture, not just the production logistics, not just the how you go about making the film. If, for example, just go with me for a second. If, for example, we had 100 people join us and we had those resources, what I would be able to do with those resources is I would be able to hire, since volunteers don't seem to be stepping forward just yet anyway, it would be hire someone to do this show. That same person would then watch us do the behind the scenes work of putting this together. That then would build an audience that might be interested in watching the film. So if we build that audience to watch the film, we have some additional money from those people that have come in. Someone else could focus on doing some teaser marketing for the project, maybe putting a little bit of money into helping to build an audience around what the film is going to be. So that by the time you start creating the film and you're making the behind the scenes stuff, the audience is interested. They're interested in the basic story idea. They're interested in watching you make the project. And then ultimately they're going to be interested, theoretically anyway, in the end film. So if we can build that audience along the way, then we stand a much better chance of making something that's going to make sufficient revenue to be able to then fund the next projects. So when I say you don't have to join me here, what I mean is you don't have to join me here. If you don't, what I'm then limited to is not having that team. I still have to focus on doing this by myself. I still have to focus on trying to build that audience by myself. I still have to focus on possibly developing the project by myself and going out and finding casting and doing all that stuff by myself, because I won't have a team. I won't have other people to come in and help me with some of that stuff or to offload some of the work. So it's not that the film's not going to get made. It's not that the film's not going to be great. It's that the creative process that goes into making the film changes, because whether we have that team or we don't have that team is going to very much dictate the choices that I can make creatively for the project. Now, the story idea that we have, I'm designing it thinking we're not going to have a team. I'm designing it thinking it's going to be primarily me and an actor and maybe someone else to help us out, maybe a couple people on various days, whoever can volunteer to help us as a sort of production assistant, sound recordist, something like that. That's it. That's all we're going to have. If there is no one else to join us. Now, if there are people who join us and become a part of all this, then with those resources, we get other people involved. We can expand it. We can grow it faster. So my whole point, and the takeaway from that for you here right now today is that the reality of making a no-budget, low-budget production is not too much different to the reality of making a bigger budget project. And that is that the target that you're shooting for is always changing. If we start down this road and then suddenly everybody goes, oh my God, I got to get involved in that, and then there is an influx of resources, well, then that changes the metric as we go along. Possibly changing the story, possibly changing what we can achieve. Maybe we have the funds or some volunteer who says, I can do kick-ass visual effects for you. I want to be involved. I want to throw my skills into the ring for free because I see the benefit that will come from it, from publicity and the fact that you're going to promote the crap out of this movie once you're done with it to help build the rest of it. All that stuff. That will change the nature of the movie. That will change the nature of the outcome. When I say that it's entirely possible I'll make something that sucks or that falls over and we'll then be able to point to we need to do this differently and that differently and that differently next time, it's because that's the nature of the process. All this stuff I've been talking about so far, the fact that it's a loop, the fact that you have to go through all 7 phases, the fact that you have to, all that stuff is part of it. All that stuff is intrinsically there in the creative process. It's intrinsically there in the production process. It's intrinsically there in the marketing of the project. It's all interconnected. It's all cause and effect. It's all step by step. It's all systematic. And so the point is, talking about money now today, the point is that if you really want to get where you're trying to go, the way to get where you're trying to go is to create and build and design an event and follow through on whatever you have available to you now. So if you're already an intermediate or advanced or pro level writer and you're looking at me going, I'm not making little no budget films. Great. Do you have a network already of people who you can get together and make a $5 million film with? Then you take all these same things that I'm talking about and you focus all of that into that project. If you have nothing at all and you don't even know anything about storytelling or screenwriting or any of this stuff, you capture what you have and you filter it all into what you do have. What I'm doing here is I'm going to show you how we do it all with nothing. So I'm going to do it all with nothing. I would like to make this a win-win situation and we build and we go and grow and we expand and we do it all with a little bit more. I think the idea warrants a little bit more than zero budget, but I want to show you that it can be done. So hopefully that makes sense today. So from a daily prompt standpoint, what can you go think about and do today for your project? Ultimately, what you have to think about is if this was actually going to get made, if you're actually going to do this story idea or whatever it might be that you have, how does the making of it or the possibility, whatever realm you're currently in, how does that affect and become a part of the creative story design and writing process? That's what I would like you to focus on today, or whatever it is that you want to focus on. But whatever you do, take action. I'm taking a lot of action these days. I hope you're taking action too, because we are going to get you where you're trying to go as long as you continue to take action and follow through. That's today's Daily Prompt. Enough out of me. We'll see you tomorrow.